there's some huge numbers posted up on the screen there, and I think for me there's a lot of interest, a lot of growth within social media and social networking, but also there's a lot of confusion around what it is, how to use it, and how to harness it from a business perspective. And I think that's very well summed up by clients I was with the other day. We were talking through some of the developments he's looking at introducing into his business. So we're looking at building a contact centre for them and integrating social media feeds into the contact centre. And one of the things that he said to me is that his chief exec had told him, I think it's time we need to embrace this social media. I think we need to look at My Face and Spacebook, and that's I mean, we had a good chuckle about it, and to me it's really summing it up what it's all about, that businesses recognise that there's probably something big going on here. There's probably something that there's some value that we can get out of engaging with this new channel of communication. It is the fastest growing channel out there ever, and it amazes me to look at the numbers, and I think also it crosses so many different generations and cultures as well. So it's great in my house. I've got my wife and my daughter, my oldest daughter, on Facebook, and it's like, well, why don't you just talk to each other, But so I think that's really where we're at, is that people recognise that it's growing, and they're trying to look at how they can integrate this into their overall communication strategy and customer strategy. But it's how do you go about doing that, and I think that's the challenge, because clearly what you don't want to do is to be trying to manipulate social networking and social media, because that's going to be a very hard situation to manage. And in fact, what you could end up being is seen as somebody trying to control the masses, and that's a tough thing. So today is really focused around talking through social media integration within the communications space. So we'll hear from Nigel from Avaya about Avaya's solutions and how they're integrating into the core platforms and technology. And I'll also talk through some of the changes within the marketplace, because it's changed a lot. We hear about wonderful terms such as unified communications and CRM of old, which seems to be having a bit of a revitalisation at the moment. So what I'll do is I'll talk through how communications have changed, but also the way in which technology is delivered today is changing as well. So drawing upon technology from the cloud and software as a service models, and with that I'll talk through the sort of cost savings, indicative savings that can be achieved by moving to these new models. So in a time where we're looking at new communication channels, and we're looking at investing in technology to help extend our reach to market and improve productivity and overall reach, we also need to be cognizant of the fact that we're in an environment today where people are scrutinising expenditure as well. So I'll share with you some ideas around cost savings and what we can do to help fund this next phase of communication evolution. I've introduced a TV channel into our business, and we post content on YouTube as well. And really we've got a number of different content types that we post onto the site. So one is presentations, the other is sort of whiteboard thought leadership pieces around the technology space, and then the other, which I thought is quite an interesting thing, is around short bursts of how to use technology. And that's where the whole idea came from before, is that how do you go and look at YouTube, right? So you want to know something, and invariably it's a short burst of information that you want to fix a problem. So how do I go and do something? So, I mean, it is, you know, how my mind works. I was doing the London to Brighton bike ride a few years back, and I had a buckled wheel, so I wanted to know how to straighten. I went onto YouTube and watched the film, and it lasted for a minute and a half. I was then an expert, straightened the wheel and no problem. So I thought, well, you know, the technology that people are using today is you know, can be quite complex. It's all supposed to be designed around ease of use and make it available to the users, but it changes and evolves at such a pace anyway, and things such as you know, the telephones, which is where as a business we've come from. People who have had training and you know, they might remember part of the training and they might get a user guide, and then a little period down the line they've forgotten how to actually do all the basic features on the phone. So that was the whole premise of our YouTube content, was to just to show people how to use the stuff that they've got, and we've put a number of clips up on YouTube and the TV side, and the thing that has had the most number of hits is actually, you know, the how to use the features on the technology, and of course with that, with tracking software and technology that we can put onto websites these days, it helps me understand an audience that otherwise I wouldn't be aware of. So I think you know, this technology has got a great place within business. You know, I'm talking to a client at the moment who's looking at putting technology together for you know, for an industry as a whole, working with global manufacturers, and they want to do the same thing. That they go and run outbound campaigns, they integrate it with email and social media, and what they want to do is to be able to do word spotting, trend spotting, and they want to also link in things such as YouTube and put promotions and competitions up there and see who's coming through. So it's for sure it's a hugely changing world, and as I said, what we'll do is we'll talk through Avaya's approach and the technology that's been created to help really harness this new channel, and then I'll go on and talk through what we're doing in the marketplace to help organisations restructure the communications infrastructure and why we're doing that, and the sort of cost savings that can be achieved to incorporate new technology.
There's two sides to it. There's demand side. Do you want to use it as you are currently using it to do PR, promotional activity, make people aware of things that you have announced or things that you're doing in the industry? Or there's the listening side, which is people are complaining about me and I need to deal with the complaint side of the house. We'll talk about that, but we'll talk more about the demand side here, because I think it's more appropriate to, you know, to what it is that you're trying to do, right? So the notion quite simply is this: there's a lot of people who are talking about social media. I define it as those four areas: Facebook, LinkedIn, Twitter and YouTube. That's what the world is coalescing around. There are lots of other sites, but if you think about the apps on your phone, the apps that your friends use and peers in the industry use, they tend to be around those four, right? So I'm not going to forget the others, but they are less relevant than those four areas. Twitter is constrained by the number of characters that you can use when sending a message. So that puts one constraint on what you can use Twitter for. Facebook, YouTube and LinkedIn are completely different, and the way that you need to think about them is completely different. Okay, and we'll go through some of the differences and how you process that. But there are probably two hot topics that people can talk about today. That's one, and cloud is the other. Okay, so we see there's generally a need for enterprises to put their arms around this and to start to manage and process what they do. Okay, and in here there are some key things that I need we think about, right? Because if you do this in a very unstructured way, you end up with a disaster. If you do this where it's part of a business process, you end up with actually the net result of being what you want. So what we as a vendor do in the market is we have a product, it's called the Social Media Manager. You stick it on your infrastructure and it allows you to automate to a greater extent what you do with Twitter, to a lesser extent with Facebook, and to a lesser extent with YouTube, because they tend to be more interactive as channels in social media. Twittersphere tends to be a blast out. It's a broadcast medium rather than a two-way interaction. At least that's the way it is at the moment. Whether that will change, we'll see. But the character limitation tends to stop it being a way of having a two-way conversation with somebody. On Twitter, what tends to happen is I will tweet something, and then another form of communication will be how I get the response. Right? Somebody will phone me, or I'll get an email, particularly on the complaint side. On the demand side, if you're tweeting a press release, it's a link to a URL, because you can't embed the press release in the tweet because it's just not physically big enough. And then more traditional means of communication will be used to follow up. Right? Your PR agency will phone you, you'll do an interview, you'll do all the things that would normally happen. So what you need to do with the Twittersphere piece is to make sure it's integrated into what you would consider business process, marketing process, right? It's a cloud technology, so you don't own it, you can't influence it, all you can do is basically plug into it. And that's true, the same is true of all of them, right? The capital cost of going on them is zero. It costs you nothing to set up a Facebook page, nothing to set up a YouTube channel, nothing to go and hashtag on in the Twitter sphere, right? So the capital cost of your business getting there is zero, and if you've got customers using mobile phones, they're app driven typically, those apps will be on those devices. So you can guarantee almost that when you tweet, your message will be received, because people carry the devices with them every day that are capable of at least picking up the communication. So the watchword for us is put it into business process. Make sure there is a plan that doesn't have this sitting in isolation and a bunch of people who don't interact with the rest of the business when they're working in social media. There's an awful lot of noise. I think, Jonathan, your stat was 95 million tweets a day. How do you filter out what's relevant versus what's irrelevant? And we'll talk through some of the ways that you do that. And when you use it in a demand side way, how do you refine the language that you use for maximum effect? Because if you're out there listening with an automated system, you can bet your life that everybody else is listening with an automated system. So if you know anything about the world of SEO, search engine optimization, the techniques and tips that we've used in the SEO world now start to apply here, but they work in reverse. And I'll go through that when we talk about this. So when you're doing it, for us it's automate it and tighten the business process. If you only remember those two things from today, those are the watchwords to take back into the company. To the extent we can automate this, but you've got to tie it into the company's core business process. We think there are those are the four process pieces that you need to do. So when you're doing the demand side, you need to gather what it is that you want to say in a cohesive and short format. You need to analyze what happens once you posted that tweet. You need then to process, to filter out the irrelevance, and then you need to basically integrate. And where it says contact center here, you would put press, PR, any of the other traditional channels that you would use for marketing. So there's two sides to this. There's I have an important press release, I am going to use Twitter as the main mechanism of broadcasting information about that press release. So your company will have a number of followers on Twitter, and you can find out who those followers are. The followers have a handle, a unique name. You can then find out how many followers they have. You can find out how many times they have tweeted about your company, or the number of times they have retweeted messages that you have broadcast out. And if you take the aggregate of all of those four things, you end up with something called a Net Promoter Score. And a Net Promoter Score, the objective is to have that individual seeing you positively in what it is that they are tweeting out on the Twitter sphere, right? And the relevance is, who are they? How many followers do they have? How active are they on Twitter? So how often are they tweeting or retweeting? And what are they saying about you? Right? And there's an algorithm you can use to mash all those four numbers together, and you end up with a 5-point scale. 0 being extremely negative, they dislike you intensely and will do things to negatively impact you in the market. 5, they are extremely positive about your business and are seen as net promoters of what it is that you do. 0 through 3.5 is a negative score. 3.5 to 5 is a positive score. Okay, and again, there's technology we can show you here where you can basically take those dynamics within Twitter, filter the numbers to get a view of the person. So Helen might have a net promoter score for a particular brand that she likes, and what the brand then does, and this might not apply to you, is you then do things to positively encourage Helen to keep tweeting positive things about you, right? So you build you build positivity and you keep building on positivity. It helps if the individual is either well known in the industry, or is a trusted peer or a blogger, or if they have some other parts of their life on the internet that allows them to be seen as not just somebody who's going to sit there on Twitter and do stuff. So analysing who you've got out there and what they say about the business becomes an important part of how you then treat the individual. And in the contact centre world, what this typically means is people get overly rewarded. You know, more airline points, more Boots Advantage points, however it might be. In this world, it's you will do things with the PR agency, you'll take them to dinner so they get to meet senior people in the business, so they get, as you said, additional access to people within the company that they are privileged to get because they're seen as net promoters for your company, right? The same is true of the extremely negative folks. There's actually an attitude that says you should try and, at some degree, win them round, or at least get them to neutral. Because if they're neutral, they're not dangerous. If they're at the negative end of the spectrum, they're just incredibly painful people to have to deal with. So when you look at the two ends of the spectrum, you absolutely need to treat people unfairly. Right? The whole notion of loyalty absolutely applies in social media. People who are incredibly loyal need to be kept incredibly loyal, and you need to do things to make sure that remains the case. And if you've got the extreme end and the negative end, then you've got to do at least some work to either be vocal in counteracting what they say or getting them to neutral. So remember, 0 to 3.5 is a negative score. Right? It's only the 1.5 between 5 and 3.6 that's actually considered to be positive. Right? So when you start to filter the people, you'll see most of them are actually in the negative bracket. Not maliciously, but that's where most people sit. You get a very small percentage that's in that top bracket, and those are the folks that you need to be able to analyse, find out who they are, process them in a different way, be it in the contact centre, it'll be I'll phone you and give you additional reward. In our world, it's a case of, right, we're going to, CEO's coming in, you're going to have an opportunity to go to dinner with the CEO, you know, and it might be a group of people, you know, so you're going to give these folks that additional level of access. And then integrating it, right? Here it's talking about the contact centre, but this is what Jonathan was talking about. To what extent do you report? What do you report on? How do you report? Who do you report to? And to what extent is there a budgetary requirement for you to be able to go to the CMO and say, right, I need an expanded budget for social media next year because these are the results that we are delivering. So an interesting question to ask is the most important thing the number of followers we have? Question mark. If that's the most important metric, then you drive all of the other things to just drive up your number of people that follow you on Twitter. Is a metric if I've got 100,000 followers, I want 1% of them to be in the 3.5 to 5 range. That changes the way that you think about how you drive that. So the strategy that you're using needs to be based on what do I want out of this? What's the important metric that I can report to the board and say we're being successful in these given areas? And what is true of the English language then becomes equally true of every other language in which you integrate this. Okay, so first thing so we have a product, it's called the Social Media Manager. It's a device, it's a server, you plug it into your network, and you then basically get it working for you in a number of different ways. So the first thing that you ask the product to do is this, searching for what we call actionable content. This tends to lend itself not so much to the demand side because you control actionable content. Right? You're tweeting what you want to say. This is more on the listening side. What are people saying, either in response to something that we as a business sent out, or do you have individuals in the company who are allowed to tweet? You do, right. So then again, if you've got hashtag LSI CEO, you know, again, based on what he might or he or she might tweet, this sits there and listens for responses to those individual tweets. And I said the trick here is to look for actionable content, because you've got a number of different things that are happening around your individual hashtag, and they need to end up in the right place in the business. So if the CEO personally needs to respond, it needs to end up with his PA or with him directly, or him or her directly. Okay, so based on what it is that you see or hear, what Social Media Manager can do is basically provide a filtered list and then an action. Right, this is what's been said in response to what you said. How do you want to respond? Now, the thing that we find is companies are taking a monolithic approach to this. They're either sticking it all in the contact center and letting agents do it, or the marketing folks are doing it, or an external agency is doing it on their behalf. Right? And the argument we have is actually you need a virtual team of all of those people, because you need legal, you need governance, compliance, you might need finance, sales, marketing. If something is being written about you in the Twitter sphere that's either extremely positive or negative, it might be around the quarterly results, it might be about a new hire. You as an individual cannot be responsible for the company's response, right? So you need to set up effectively a virtual team of people who you then engage in what that response needs to be. They all don't need to be listening to the Twitter sphere, right? They don't need to have TweetDeck installed or any of these applications. What they need is an email that is sent to them, that's sent with an appropriate level of priority, which gathers them together for a collaborative session about how you respond. Okay, and if you think about all the different departments that might need to be, you might need to go to somebody in the CFO's office, somebody in the CMO's office, somebody in legal, governance, compliance, however you structure that. But ideally, the virtual team should consist of an individual from within those groups who are able to come together as a matter of priority sometimes to then respond to something which has gone on in the Twitter sphere. Yeah? Or you might decide that it's a slower burn, you don't need to respond immediately, you can actually let that one rest a while, so your email becomes of lower priority. But the objective here is to have a group of people put their eyes and ears on what the response should be before somebody in the company or an automated system in the company actually posts the response. So again, what we see is you can't just leave it to the folks in marketing, you can't leave it to the contact center, you can't leave it to an external agency. It has to be a combination of all of the affected parts of the business that need to generate the response. And this is what people struggle with. It tends to just live in one place. Right? So the argument, or our argument is, that's fine as a place for this data to come in, but once the product or the automated system has filtered out the message, you just can't leave it to an individual. Because you could get yourself into an awful lot of trouble as an individual by responding inappropriately to a particular tweet. Facebook we're not so much bothered about because you can control Facebook in a much greater way. Twitter is the problem because it tends to be very short in terms of the characters that you can use, and the speed is again the challenge with Twitter. Right? And if it's something that's interesting, and that's the beauty of this application, is it's such a time waster, is you go click. Right, so it puts it right in front of you and you go and action it. Whereas Facebook you wouldn't. And Facebook, you can write reams. Twitter, you've got 140 characters or less to get your point across. That product will monitor everything. Right, so if you're starting to see a lot of this erroneous stuff and the storm that follows before it calms down, Social Media Manager captures all of that, so you have a record of it. Right, so you can see what happens when somebody misspells, gets the thing cut off too short. You might treat that as a false positive, but you still responded to it. You took time out of your day to deal with an error. Okay, so what Social Media Manager does is and I'll show you this, we've got a slide on this which goes through it in more detail, but at the top level it says, okay, I'm listening in the Twitter sphere for stuff that is related to your company. If there are individuals who are tweeting, I've got those hashtags as well, and then based on what I see, I will make a routing decision about where I send that, that piece of information. But I'm also going to check to make sure that it's actually a relevant conversation. So you've got the classic Continental Airlines and Continental tyres. Right, so if you're Continental, how do you differentiate between somebody querying about a tyre versus how you query for something to do with an airline? So there's some logic that we have written into the product that allows it to have a sense of context around the sentence. Right, so in the case here, you've got Continental seems incapable of boarding a plane in a timely manner. Continental urges motorists to invest in winter tyres. Right, they're both off the same hashtag essentially, but one is to do with airlines and one is to do with tyres. So the product allows you to do that context filtering, right? It applies and it learns about things that are relevant, and by dint of learning, it simply ditches everything else. I'll be honest, it doesn't apply much more common sense than that. But once it's figured out that you're in the business that you are in, right, and you program it to look for certain keywords and certain phrases and then certain things that you are interested in, it starts to mash that together to give you a logical view of what is going on. Because typically in 100,000 tweets, less than 1% relevant is what we've been finding in times when we've done this with customers. So you've got less than 1% of all of that noise is actually relevant to your business, unless there's an incident. Okay, so Scottish Southern Power, if they have a power outage in a certain area, they will see a spike in traffic around power's gone, have you lost yours, you see a whole people setting conversations around the fact there's a power outage in a given area. And what we're trying to educate them to do at the moment is, if you've got a contact centre, you know the postcode where the power's gone, you know the mobile phone numbers of people who live in that postcode, send them a text. Right, it's prepared text. Power, we know we've got a problem, blah blah blah, you hit the button once and that goes out to tens of thousands of customers, so it stops all of the noise either into the contact centre or in Twitter or wherever it is about poor customer service. So you turn it and proactively reach out, which is the other way of doing this. Again, not so much an issue if you don't have that customer service facing utility type of model. But depending again on, another classic is you send the new price list out with an error in it. So if the price list has got, there's somebody's put a comma in the wrong place, or there's an extra 0 on, and you know what happens next, right? The phone lines light up because people are querying what's in this latest price list. If there's an error and you've identified the error, you might use social media to proactively outreach and say, no, we've got this wrong, look for this file or whatever it is that changes it. So you stop the inbound noise by having recognised the error, do something proactively out. So filter out the noise is one of the aspects of what the device does. And then what you've basically got is the product will listen to a number of social channels. Okay, so you can program it to watch what's being said about you in Facebook. You can get it to monitor your Facebook wall. You can get it to look at Twitter, which is what most people are doing with this product currently. That's where the action is as far as we're concerned. LinkedIn tends to be more of a controlled environment. It's professionals in the industry rather than Joe Public. So again, it has its own sort of set of rules. And whilst I said, we monitor the other channels, RSS feeds, Bebo, YouTube and the like, they tend to be less relevant versus what's going on in that middle box there. Okay, we don't look at Skype, we don't look at SMS messages. Right, that tends to have to go and live inside the main contact center, but it tends to be you're doing that for a slightly different reason. You want to have an interactive conversation with somebody rather than broadcast something out. So this definitely looks at the social media world rather than what we would call other channels or standard media. And as I said, the objective here is I will filter out what is relevant and I will then do something with it. And in the contact center world, that's what we call contact routing, so sending it through to the most appropriate individual. If you've got a contact center that's basically a virtual group of people, it doesn't know, it'll just forward the message. Okay, so this doesn't have to be centered around what goes on in the contact center. It can be centered around a group of virtual people who are a mail group, and what it does is it sends out to that mail group. Now, what you tend to need is somebody responsible for monitoring that mail group. And that might be you, right, in terms of we've got this, we've got to deal with it, get a conference call together now because we need to respond quickly to this. So it's highly disruptive, but based on what's going on out there, you might choose the speed at which you respond to what it is that you're seeing and hearing. So the agents and experts are you folks, right? These are not contact center people, these are people within your teams, and it might be your PR agency, which is external to you, and it might be all of those functional groups internally that, depending upon what has been said and how quickly you think you need to respond, the action is a speed dial, audio conference, what are we going to say? Do you clear it? Do we agree? Yes. Get somebody to write it, might be your agency that writes it, and then you respond in a timely manner. But you've had the right folks legitimize the response. Okay? Classic cases are quarterly results that are below expectation. So that tends to cause a bit of a flutter with most people, but that's coming, so you can actually prepare for that. Competitors buying competitors in your space tends to generally be a news story, so you need to have a competitive response around, are you now the number one in your industry, or have you just become the number two because these two folks got together and now become the number one? So that tends to have a higher level of priority around corporately what you do. And then the good news around major wins, corporate responsibility, any corporate social responsibility stuff that you're doing, the sort of the softer, slightly better news stories, again, you can manage how that gets sent out, and these folks probably aren't so relevant in the conversation. Okay, so within the process, there's the standard, it's a quarterly results time, they're better than expected, wonderful, we can say some incredibly positive things, but you control the environment. Competition is just acquired competition, knee-jerk reaction, how do we as a business respond, which is different, you're not in control of events, and there's corporate responsibility and the other stuff that you do, which is which makes people feel good about the brand, that again, you control that environment. So the group interaction is more or less depending upon what it is that you're trying to do. But what the business needs to have figured out is almost an SLA. If competitor A acquires competitor B, I will have a response written within 2 hours, Pacific Standard Time, or Eastern Standard Time, or GMT, depending on what you're working to, right? So you almost need to have an SLA within the business that says, when something like this happens, this will be our response. And that's the sort of thing that board people like to hear, because then it looks like process. It looks like something they can see and feel and understand, and they can measure it, and you can measure it and go and ask for more money when it's gone incredibly well, yeah? So the notion that it becomes process is very important. And that is a sort of process. It'll look different by each company that we talk to, but that's the process. Let's listen, let's analyze, filter out the rubbish, send it through to the appropriate people, which could be an email group, get together a virtual team within the business that is then responsible for the response that the corporation makes. Yeah? And that's the bit we don't see happening. That's the bit where this goes wrong. Out of the automated piece, you can generate reports, log files, you tell it what you want it to report on, it'll report on it for you. Again, it's down to what's important as metrics for you. Is it the number of tweets, number of followers, number of posts per week, per month? Don't know. Right? Those are something that that you will sit down with your folks and figure out what an SLA looks like and what's important to measure and report on. But we gather all the data. You just decide what you want to do with it. The point about it is that if you know who not the marketing side for a second, but the more commercial people in the organisations, if those folks are also on Twitter or they're using social media, you can add a field in your database so you add their hashtag, and then you can program the social media manager to just look at their hashtag. You might not be interested in what they have to say, or you might, right? But what that can track within the customer service context is the number of times an individual in your business partner has tweeted about their interaction with LSI. And that can become quite interesting, right? Because I don't know if you have a partner program, tiering system, you have platinum, silver, gold, classic type of tiering. But you can start to use that as a method for independently tracking what third parties are saying about you when they are at least nominally your business partners. But it requires you to make data, it requires you to modify your CRM to include fields that track that level of activity. And again, Social Media Manager will spit out this stuff all day. You just have to find a way of having it have a home to go to. So you can interact more with the back end of your business using this, but it's a choice that you will make, right? You don't have to do this. It's just, and we have started to do this. We have been doing it for a long time, but we find it quite interesting to see what our business partners are saying about us in the Twitter sphere. It's an interesting metric to see what's being said about you by third parties who are, as I said, nominally business partners, but they might also trade with your competitors. In fact, they probably do. Certainly, it works that's the way it works in our world. Social context, I think we've talked about. So this is this notion of a net promoter score. Who is the individual? How many followers? How often do they tweet, retweet? Is what they say largely positive or negative? Mash those numbers together, get a score. 0 to 3.5 is negative to neutral. 3.6 and above is positive. Okay, so that's what, this is effectively what we call social context, because it's true that in the Twitter sphere some people are more active than others, some people are listened to more than others. You just got to find out who those folks are and make sure that you respond accordingly in terms of the way that you treat them. And the same is true with the incredibly negative people. You might have journalists who do nothing but write bad stuff about you. Like Lord knows we've had that ourselves in the past. Might be about journalists who just don't want to know Avaya, don't want to get engaged. So you either decide that you're going to leave them and deal with them as a group of people who are never going to get your story, or you try to encourage them, bring them into the fold, do all the stuff that you would do over and above to try and get them off the negative and into the neutral. Because once they're neutral, they're less damaging them than at any other end of that spectrum. So you might, again, take a look at what you've got going on from a context point of view, the relevance of the individual, what they are saying, how often they're saying it, and what do you want to do about it. And again, key thing here, and we haven't talked about it beyond the assumption that it's English language, it isn't. So you would need to take a look at how you would deploy this type of system so it would monitor the G6 languages. And then again, whereas this is almost a corporate thing, as you roll that out into offices in region, you would need to include regional people as part of this virtual organisation. Because somebody tweeting something negative in Germany might still have a legal implication in terms of the way that you reply. This is a network device, so you don't have to install anything on your desktop. It just sits there and listens and only sends you what's relevant. So it filters out the noise, right, and it tends to be less intrusive in terms of the way it interacts with you as an individual on your desktop. So it automates a lot of the stuff that you would spend time in TweetDeck or Radian6, who've been acquired now. It takes all of that away and actually automates it for you and just makes it a network device that does that on your behalf. And when a new competitor comes into the market, you would go to one device to program the hashtags around a single instance, right, rather than having to go to every individual instance of TweetDeck to then get everybody configuring it in the same way. And it works internally and externally. Okay, so you've got consistency across what your PR agency is doing and seeing versus what you're seeing as well internally, right? You don't have any of that inconsistency. So it just removes the noise. I had TweetDeck on here, I've taken it off. It was just too disruptive, right? So I take feeds now from our own internal social media manager. That's what I get emails from. And it just makes it a much simpler way of interacting with what's going on. And then, as we talked about this, bring it into a group of subject matter experts, not necessarily in the contact centre, virtual teams as we've talked about, but basically are responsible for then producing the response to what is being said about you in social media. And that's pretty much it in terms of, we've got a device that you can purchase that does that. Works in those languages. What I think is more interesting here is the conversation around the process and applying what we think are a good set of rules and metrics to your business, or at least giving you a set of ideas to walk away with that says if we're going to go and do this, we need to think about it in a non-isolated way. That's the key. As I said, it's business process and automation. If you can just make it those two things, you solve a lot of the problems that we see companies who are stumbling across this doing it because they're not making it a core part of what they do. And they don't do it because they don't believe it. If you do it willingly, you believe it, you will engage. If you're being forced into it, slightly different mentality. But if you've got folks who are willing to give this thing a go because it's incredibly powerful, you're in a good place. So the questions become one for you, which is, right, we've got a set of ideas, project plan, implementation, rollout, go. Yeah, that tends to be what